racist, and full of hate. A cop arrests a 5-year-old black boy, thinking it's just another act of unchecked power. But when he discovers who this boy really is, his entire world begins to crumble. By the end, the truth will leave you speechless. It was a quiet afternoon in a suburban neighborhood. Children's laughter echoed in the streets as they played outside, carefree and full of life. Among them was 5-year-old Jamal, a bright-eyed boy with a radiant smile and an infectious laugh. He clutched his toy truck, running around the park with the kind of joy only a child could exude. But that joy would soon be shattered. Officer Mark Reynolds, a seasoned cop with a reputation for being tough, was patrolling the area. But Mark wasn't just known for being tough. He was known for his bias. His gaze scanned the park, narrowing when he spotted Jamal. To him, the boy didn't belong. His uniform and badge gave him a dangerous sense of authority, one he often wielded without care. Mark stepped out of his car, the sound of the door slamming echoing like a thunderclap in the peaceful park. He walked toward Jamal, his hand resting on his belt, as if ready to draw a weapon. Parents and children in the park froze, their laughter replaced by a tense silence. "Hey, kid!" Mark barked. Jamal turned, his wide eyes filled with confusion. "What are you doing here?" "I'm playing," Jamal replied softly, clutching his toy truck a little tighter. His innocent voice was trembling, but polite. Mark's expression hardened. "This isn't your place," he snapped. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed Jamal's arm roughly, ignoring the boy's cry of pain. The park erupted in gasps, but no one dared to intervene. Jamal's toy truck fell to the ground, its bright red paint now smeared with dirt. Tears streamed down his face as he looked around for help. "Please, I didn't do anything," he sobbed. But Mark didn't care. To him, Jamal was just another troublemaker, a face that fit a stereotype. He dragged the boy toward his patrol car as though he was a criminal, his small feet struggling to keep up. "You're coming with me," Mark growled. The scene was heartbreaking. A child, barely old enough to tie his shoes, being treated as though he was a threat. His innocence was disregarded, his voice silenced, all because of the color of his skin. Parents whispered among themselves, horrified, but too scared to step in. One mother clutched her own child tightly, her eyes welling with tears as she watched the injustice unfold. The community felt the weight of Mark's actions, but their fear kept them frozen in place. Jamal's cries grew fainter as Mark shoved him into the back of the patrol car. The door slammed shut, trapping the boy in a cage of prejudice and power. And as the car drove away, the playground fell silent, the echo of what had just happened lingering in the air like a haunting memory. The voice on the other end was icy, sharp, and filled with a quiet fury. "This is Chief Inspector Daniels. You arrested my son. Care to explain yourself?" Mark's face turned ghostly white as the weight of his actions began to sink in. Mark froze, the phone slipping slightly in his sweaty hand. "Your son?" he stammered, his voice losing its usual arrogance. His heart pounded, and for the first time that day, he felt a flicker of fear. "Yes, my son," Chief Inspector Daniels snapped. His voice was controlled, but the simmering anger was undeniable. "You arrested a 5-year-old child, my child, and I want an explanation. Now." Mark scrambled for words, his mind racing. "Sir, I thought he was causing trouble in the park. He looked suspicious, and Daniels cut him off sharply. "Suspicious? A 5-year-old? Are you hearing yourself right now? You're telling me my son, playing in a park, looked like a threat to you?" The silence on Mark's end was deafening. He had no excuse, no justification. "Stay where you are," Daniels continued, his tone like steel. "I'm coming down to the station. And Officer Reynolds, you better have a good lawyer." The line went dead, leaving Mark sitting there, his face pale and his hands trembling. His colleagues, who had overheard parts of the call, exchanged nervous glances. No one spoke, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Back in the holding room, Jamal sat silently, his small frame dwarfed by the cold metal bench. His eyes were red from crying, and his little hands clutched his knees tightly. He didn't understand why he was there, Why the man in the uniform had been so mean. The door burst open and in rushed his mother, Lisa Daniels. Her face was a mixture of fury and anguish as she knelt before her son, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Baby, I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mommy's here. You're safe now." Jamal clung to her, his small hands gripping her shirt as fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. "Why did he take me, Mommy?" he sobbed. "I didn't do anything wrong." Lisa's heart shattered. She kissed his forehead and held him tighter, fighting back her own tears. "Baby, you didn't do anything wrong. That man, he made a mistake. But I promise you, he's going to answer for it." Minutes later, the station doors slammed open, and Chief Inspector Daniels strode in, his presence commanding immediate respect and fear. Every officer in the room froze, their eyes darting between him and Mark, who was now sweating profusely. Daniels locked eyes with Mark, his gaze like a laser cutting through him. "You, stand up," he barked. Mark rose slowly, his usual bravado completely gone. Sir, Don't. Speak." Daniels cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. "You arrested my son, a 5-year-old boy, for playing in a park. Tell me, Officer Reynolds, what exactly about my child made you think he was a threat?" Mark swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. I thought he didn't belong there. He looked out of place and I acted on instinct." As Officer Mark Reynolds drove away with Jamal in the back seat, the boy's quiet sobs filled the car. Mark didn't even glance at him, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. He told himself he was doing his job, but deep down, a small, nagging feeling stirred, a feeling he refused to acknowledge. Meanwhile, back at the park, word of what had happened spread like wildfire. Parents shared videos and photos they'd taken of the arrest, their outrage growing with every retelling. Social media exploded with hashtags and posts. Hashtag Justice for Jamal, hashtag End Racism, and hashtag Protect Our Children flooded timelines. The community was furious, and they weren't staying silent. One of the witnesses, a young teacher named Sarah, couldn't shake the image of Jamal's tear-streaked face. She knew she had to do something. She uploaded her video of the incident to the local news outlet's tip line, adding a caption that read, "This is what racism looks like in our community. A 5-year-old black boy arrested for simply playing in a park." Within hours, the video went viral. News outlets picked up the story, reporters descended on the neighborhood, and the police department found itself under a spotlight they couldn't escape. The community demanded answers, but the department stayed silent, shielding Mark from the storm. When Mark arrived at the station, he yanked Jamal out of the car and led him inside, ignoring the questioning glances from other officers. "Put him in holding," Mark barked to the desk officer, who looked shocked. "Mark, he's just a kid," the officer said hesitantly, glancing at Jamal, who was trembling and clutching his tiny hands together. "I said, put him in holding," Mark snapped, his voice cold and unwavering. The desk officer complied reluctantly, guiding Jamal to a small holding room that was far too big for his tiny frame. Jamal sat on the cold metal bench, his legs dangling off the edge. He sniffled, trying to stop the tears that wouldn't stop falling. He wanted his mum. He wanted to go home. Hours passed, and Jamal sat alone in the room, his cries eventually turning into exhausted silence. The station phone rang, cutting through the quiet hum of the office. "Police department," answered the desk officer. The voice on the other end was firm and authoritative. "This is Chief Inspector Daniels. I need to speak to the officer who arrested my son. Now." The desk officer froze, the color draining from his face. Your son?" he stammered. "Yes," Daniels replied, his voice filled with restrained anger. "Jamal Daniels is my son, and I want to know why he was arrested. Put me through to whoever is responsible for this, immediately." The realization hit like a bolt of lightning. Jamal wasn't just any child. He was the son of one of the most respected and powerful figures in law enforcement, and the officer responsible for his arrest was about to face the consequences of his blind hatred. Mark, oblivious to the brewing storm, leaned back in his chair, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. But his smug demeanor wouldn't last for long. The desk officer approached him, his face pale. "Mark, you need to take this call, now." Mark grabbed the receiver, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, this is Officer Reynolds." "Instinct." Daniels's voice rose, his anger boiling over. "Your instinct was racism, plain and simple. You saw a black child and assumed he didn't belong. You didn't ask questions. You didn't look for a parent. You didn't do your job. You acted on prejudice." The other officers looked on, their faces a mixture of shock and discomfort. No one dared to intervene. "You have disgraced this badge, this station, and this community," Daniels continued, his voice shaking with controlled rage. "You thought you could get away with this because he was just another black boy. But you picked the wrong child this time, Reynolds." Mark's legs felt weak. The weight of his actions was crashing down on him, and for the first time, he felt the full gravity of what he'd done. Outside the station, protesters had already gathered. Signs reading, "Justice for Jamal" and "End Racism Now" filled the air as chants echoed down the street. News cameras lined the sidewalks, capturing the growing outrage. Inside, Chief Inspector Daniels turned to Lisa, who held Jamal protectively in her arms. "I'm taking my son home," she said firmly, her voice trembling with both anger and relief. Daniels nodded. "Take him home. I'll handle this." As Lisa left with Jamal, Mark stood frozen, knowing his life would never be the same. He had thought he was untouchable, but now the full weight of justice, and his own hatred, was closing in on him. Mark sat in the interrogation room, the same cold metal table and chairs he'd seen countless suspects occupy. But now, the roles were reversed, and the badge clipped to his chest felt more like a burden than a shield. Across the table sat Chief Inspector Daniels, his eyes locked on Mark with an intensity that made him squirm in his seat. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Daniels finally spoke, his voice low but cutting. "I've seen a lot of things in my career, Reynolds, but this is a new low. You've not only disgraced this department, but you've also damaged the trust of the community we're supposed to protect." Mark swallowed hard. "Sir, Don't. Speak," Daniels snapped, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't the time for excuses. I've reviewed the footage, heard the witnesses, and seen my son's face. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. You let your racism cloud your judgment, and now you're going to pay for it." Mark shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. He opened his mouth to respond, but the door burst open before he could utter a word. Two internal affairs officers walked in, their presence a clear indication of what was about to happen. "Officer Mark Reynolds," one of them said, his voice stern. "You are hereby placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Turn over your badge and firearm." Mark froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his badge. The gravity of the situation hit him like a freight train. Slowly, he unpinned the badge from his chest and placed it on the table, followed by his firearm. The humiliation was unbearable, but the worst was yet to come. Outside the station, the protests had grown louder and larger. People of all ages and races stood together, their voices united in demanding justice. Signs reading, "No justice, no peace, and protect our children," filled the air as chants echoed through the streets. Among the crowd was Sarah, the teacher who had uploaded the video. She held a megaphone and addressed the crowd, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "This is not just about Jamal. This is about every child who has ever been judged by the color of their skin. It's about holding people like Mark Reynolds accountable for their actions. We're here to say, enough is enough." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants growing even louder. News reporters captured every moment, and the story became a national headline. Social media erupted with calls for systemic change, and #Justice for Jamal trended worldwide. At home, Mark sat alone in his dimly lit living room. The walls, once adorned with commendations and certificates, now seemed to close in on him. The sound of the protesters outside still echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of the irreversible damage he had done. He turned on the television, and there it was, his face plastered across every news channel. The footage of him dragging Jamal to his patrol car played on a loop, accompanied by headlines like "Racist Cop Arrests 5-Year-Old Black Boy" and "Calls for Reform After Shocking Incident." Mark's family, once proud of his career, refused to speak to him. His wife had taken their kids and left, unable to reconcile his actions with the man she thought she knew. For the first time in his life, Mark was forced to confront the ugliness within himself. Every justification he had clung to felt hollow now. He had been wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong. Meanwhile, at the Daniels home, Lisa and Jamal sat together on the couch. Jamal held a stuffed bear tightly, his eyes wide as he watched cartoons. Lisa stroked his hair gently, her heart breaking for the fear and confusion her son had endured. "Mummy?" Jamal asked softly. "Yes, baby." "Why did that man take me? I didn't do anything bad." Lisa's eyes filled with tears, but she kept her voice steady. "Because some people don't see how special you are, Jamal. But that doesn't mean you're not. You're brave, smart, and loved, and we're going to make sure that man never does this to anyone else again." Jamal nodded, his little hand reaching for hers. "Okay, Mummy." Back at the station, the police department held a press conference. The police chief, standing alongside Chief Inspector Daniels, addressed the community's outrage. "We are deeply sorry for the actions of Officer Mark Reynolds," the chief began, his voice solemn. "His behavior does not reflect the values of this department. We are committed to conducting a thorough investigation and ensuring justice is served. To Jamal Daniels and his family, we owe an apology we can never fully express." Daniels stepped forward, his voice strong and unwavering. "This isn't just about my son. It's about accountability and change. My family has suffered, but so have countless others. This ends now." The crowd outside erupted into applause, their voices demanding justice louder than ever. The fallout from the incident rippled far beyond the confines of the police station. Mark Reynolds, now stripped of his badge and humiliated on a national stage, faced a reality he couldn't escape. Protests outside his home grew louder each night, with signs declaring him the face of a broken system. He sat in his darkened living room, staring at the paperwork from his department, termination papers. The weight of his actions, now fully apparent, bore down on him like a crushing tide. Mark turned on the television, scrolling through channels to distract himself, but every station seemed to carry the same story. He stopped on a segment featuring Lisa Daniels, sitting beside Jamal during an interview. "He's just a little boy," Lisa said, her voice steady but full of pain. "All he wanted to do was play at the park, like any child should be able to. Instead, he was treated like a criminal. No child should ever have to experience that. Ever." Jamal sat quietly beside her, holding his mother's hand. When asked if he was scared, he nodded. "I just wanted to go home," he whispered. Mark's chest tightened as he watched. The image of Jamal's tear-streaked face haunted him, and for the first time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: shame. Days later, Mark stood in front of the community center, clutching a folded piece of paper in his hands. He had been invited, or rather, summoned, to a town hall meeting organized by Lisa Daniels and Sarah, the teacher who first shared the video. The hall was packed, with members of the community, activists, and reporters all present. On stage sat Lisa, Sarah, and Chief Inspector Daniels. When Mark's name was called, a hush fell over the room. He walked to the microphone, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on him. He unfolded the paper with trembling hands and took a deep breath. I came here tonight because I owe this community an apology, he began, his voice unsteady. What I did to Jamal was wrong. It was racist, it was cruel, and it was inexcusable. There's no justification for what I did, and I take full responsibility for my actions. The room remained silent, the audience waiting for more. I let my biases guide me, Mark continued, his voice cracking. I saw a black child, and instead of seeing his innocence, I saw a stereotype. That's on me, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I am here to say I'm sorry. He looked directly at Lisa and Jamal, who sat in the front row. To you, Jamal, and to your family. I am so sorry. Tears welled in Lisa's eyes as she held Jamal close. The audience murmured, their reactions mixed. Some saw sincerity in Mark's words, while others remained skeptical, their trust too damaged to repair with words alone. Mark's apology, though heartfelt, wasn't enough to shield him from the consequences of his actions. Weeks later, he stood in court, facing charges of misconduct and abuse of power. The footage of Jamal's arrest was played for the jury, his cries echoing through the courtroom. Lisa Daniels testified, her voice strong as she recounted the trauma her son had endured. My son will carry this experience with him for the rest of his life. It's not just about this one incident, it's about the system that allows it to happen. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. Mark was sentenced to community service and mandatory racial sensitivity training, a punishment many felt was too lenient. But for Lisa, the true victory was the spotlight now shining on systemic racism within law enforcement. Months later, the community began to heal. The Daniels family worked tirelessly to turn their pain into progress, founding a local initiative called Jamal's Voice to advocate for children's rights and combat racial injustice. The initiative gained national attention, sparking conversations and reforms in communities across the country. Jamal, though still young, found his strength. I'm not scared anymore, he said during the initiative's first event. I know my voice matters. As for Mark, his life had been irrevocably changed. He completed his service and training, but the stain of his actions followed him. He spent his days volunteering quietly, staying out of the spotlight, and reflecting on the person he had been, and the person he wanted to become. In the end, Jamal's story wasn't just about a single act of racism. It was about resilience, accountability, and the power of a community to demand change. It served as a painful reminder of the work still to be done, but also as a beacon of hope for a future where children like Jamal could play freely, without fear, in any park, anywhere.